Hey everyone, welcome back to the Rhetoric Prof channel. Today I'm going to be doing a video on rebuttal. How do we create rebuttal in arguments in an effective way? What is rebuttal? What are some of the types of it? And as you can see from my list here, which is only a partial list, there are so many ways to think about rebuttal. There's so many different possibilities. It can be overwhelming. That rebuttal is not a topic that can be exhausted in a single YouTube video. This is just to give you a way of thinking about some of the diverse possibilities that you might approach rebuttal with in your own debates or arguments when you're looking at media and trying to be a little bit more critical about it, lots of different things. So one thing that I want to begin with is talking a little bit about what rebuttal means in the theory of argument. There are lots of different ways that it's used commonly, and honestly, there are different ways that it's used in argumentation theory. But one way I like to think about rebuttal is that a rebuttal is when you explicitly take as the object of your argumentation the argument of an opposing view, an explicitly stated argument of somebody else. And so we might have lots of arguments that kind of broadly talk about other people's positions. We imagine opponents. This happens a lot in debates as well. But when we're thinking about rebuttal, we're thinking about specific claims that someone prior to us has made in a piece of writing or in a speech or something like that. So with that in mind, we're going to be looking today at a very specific argument. It happens to just be the first one that I found when I looked at the New York Times op-ed page. I think you'll find it pretty interesting, and it's called The Case Against Zoos. So today, I'm not here trying to make a case for zoos, but I will be doing some rebuttal of some of the arguments and claims made in that, just as ways of demonstrating how you might approach rebuttal. So we're going to be talking a lot about zoos. Okay, so when we think about rebuttal, we can think about a couple different places, little hinges or little nodes where you might actually make your rebuttal. The first one and the most obvious one is you can rebut the claim. So the claim in this article is that zoos are bad for animals. And I could just make a counterclaim and say, no, zoos are not bad. But really at that level, we're not really rebutting yet because neither of those are arguments by themselves. An argument, as you see right on the very top here, an argument implies a claim and its support. A claim and a reason, a claim and some evidence for it. A claim by itself usually does not count as an argument. People can claim whatever they want. It's really only an argument when it has some context and some reasons for why we might believe it or why we might accept it or assent to it or adhere to it, whatever you want to say. So when we just have claim and counterclaim, we're not really doing rebuttal, but we can sometimes point out that somebody else in a debate hasn't sufficiently defended their claims. So though a lot of people think about this first one as being what rebuttal is mostly about, I would say that this is actually probably the least common one. This is not something that comes up a whole lot. So you can say, okay, my opponent doesn't have any evidentiary support for their claim. They're just kind of making this claim. They maybe gave you a reason to believe it, but that reason's just another claim. There's no solid evidence. This is something that people do a lot of times. I've listened to a lot of high school debates. This is a lot of what the debate sounds like. And that's okay as far as it goes, except that we would want some reason beyond that. There's a lot of times when we accept arguments on the basis of reasoning. We don't have to have some statistical information to have an argument. So what we really want to show there is that that claim specifically would require us to have evidentiary support. We would say this is really an empirical question. It's not something that can be settled based on armchair reflections or something like that. We can also say when someone just makes a claim that they have no or insufficient reasoning for that the reasons don't really support what they're saying, that's not enough reason to take it. And so basically, even when we're attacking a claim, we're thinking about the support of the claim, that it's not there. And that can be one way that you approach rebuttal. But I would say, honestly, again, probably the least common to actually come up. Though it is a good thing to kind of prick your ears and try to write down, if you're in a debate, every claims that your opponents make as a way of organizing your notes on a debate or on an article. Say, well, what are they really claiming here? And if you have some claims down there and you say, well, I don't know what they said to support that, that might be something that you can use when you're going to give your speech or you're going to write in response and say, I don't think that this claim should really be counted in the debate. I don't think that this claim is something that we as an audience or we as a community should accept. And here's another way of looking at it that you're now going to propose. It's a good way to introduce your own claim that will maybe take the place of that claim. Okay. So the second thing you can do is challenge your opponent's evidence on its own terms. And there's a few ways. I just give three here. There's lots of ways that people think about evidence. That could be a whole series of videos just unto itself. But I give three of the most common ways that evidence is challenged. And I have a few examples here from the article that we'll look at. The first one I say is fallacious reasoning, that the kind of reasoning that ends up being the support for the claim is itself not valid or is not sound or something like that. Oftentimes these are called logical fallacies. I don't love the term logical fallacy because it implies that there's a kind of logical correctness, that if you just followed that, you wouldn't make these mistakes. There's a reason why there is a tradition why they're called logical fallacies, and they do have something to do with reasoning, but oftentimes those patterns of reasoning that are fallacious in one case or misleading in one case do work in other ones. So for instance, one of my favorite fallacies is called sometimes the no true Scotsman fallacy, where you'd say, well, no true Scotsman would put ketchup on his eggs, something like that. And you would say, well, if I have evidence that someone who's Scottish does do that, you're just going to discount that because you're saying, well, that already invalidates them. So it's a kind of ends up being circular reasoning. But there are cases in which obviously we want to say, okay, well, anyone who would do that shouldn't be considered one of us. Or anything that has that property shouldn't be considered part of this class. So that can not always be a fallacy, though it sometimes is. So that's fallacious reasoning. Let's see what we have here by way of fallacious reasoning. Here's another one that I pulled from the articles. I only have one for this set here for number 2, but this is a good one. So in her article, she begins by saying, I should know the name of the person I'm going to rebut. Her name is all the way at the bottom, not at the top, because it's the New York Times. Well, this is published in the New York Times, by the way. Emma Maris, and she is an environmental writer and the author of the forthcoming book, Wild Souls, Freedom and Flourishing in the Non-Human World. Okay. So a lot of the beginning of this article, zoos are bad, or the case against zoos, you can follow this link here if you'd like. I'll also post it in the title or in the video description on YouTube. And she makes this argument. Throughout history, men have accumulated large and fierce animals to advertise their might and prestige. Power-mad men from Henry III to Saddam Hussein's son Uday to the drug kingpin Pablo Escobar to Emperor Charlemagne all tried to underscore their strength by keeping terrifying beasts captive. William Randolph Hearst, who's the newspaper magnate from back in the day, created his own private zoo with lions, tigers, leopards, and more at Hearst Castle. It is these boastful collections of animals, these autocratic menageries, from which the modern zoo with its didactic plaques and $15 hot dogs springs. So really, this is the part here that I would say I could argue is fallacious. It could be kind of the fallacy of the bad origin or something like that. Well, just because something has a bad start doesn't mean that its contemporary manifestation should be held guilty for all of that past. Maybe people recognize this. And in fact, she talks about in the rest of the article how people have kind of adapted. So why would we say that the zoo today, because people have had bad zoos in the past, that all zoos are bad? That's potentially a kind of fallacy that we could say, or I don't even call it a fallacy. I would just say that's not the best kind of reasoning for this case. So that's one way that you could think about it. Another one is you could say this person's using an unreliable source. So when they say, where'd you get that evidence from? This is something that people also like to do in kind of high school debates, be like, aha, I've caught you out, because a lot of times they think that those kinds of arguments are debate enders. You've used a bad source, your argument is gone. But really, that's not how it works, because what makes a source unreliable also requires argumentation. Well, you have to say, cui bono, is someone profiting from this? Is the source maybe misunderstood in the way that it's being used? That could be something that you might say. But you have to make an argument about why we shouldn't take this source at face value, why we shouldn't trust the evidence that's coming from it, or maybe we shouldn't at least trust the interpretation that's given to this evidence. And sometimes that's pretty difficult to do in a kind of live debate when you don't have the preparation to see it, but especially in written debates, this is always a good thing to do. In newspaper articles like here, they give you lots of hyperlinks. Click through those hyperlinks, and sometimes you'll be surprised, like, wait a minute, is that all they're citing? That's not very good evidence, even in so-called reliable sources like the New York Times. And finally, one other thing that you might do is say, well, my opponent opponent has insufficient data, that what they've presented here by way of data or evidence that's merely anecdotal. It doesn't kind of really prove their point. It's just not enough. So it's not that it's false. It's not that the source is lying to us, just that it's not enough. So those are some arguments that you might make about the claim or about the support. The vast majority, though, the vast majority of rebuttal, I think, happens on number 3, which is the relationship between the claim and its support. How does the support that's given in an argument, it's the evidence, the anecdote, the narrative, whatever it may be, how does that actually support the claim? And that is always going to be an inferential gap. There's always going to be some kind of inference that we want the audience to make if we're making it, but that also makes it open or leaves it open to potential rebuttals. So I have a whole bunch here already, and this could become arbitrarily long. So I've kind of selected and described a few things here, mostly because I found them in the article, and I'll give you a bunch of examples. So the first one is the evidence cited for the claim actually supports the counterclaim. This is so nice when it happens. Someone says, gives you evidence of why something is bad or why something is good, and you say, well, if we really took that by itself, wouldn't we think just the opposite? So here's an example from the article. She writes, there are a few exceptions. She's talking about, she's making the claim that zoos don't reintroduce animals into the wild. She says, but there are a few exceptions. The Arabian oryx, an antelope native to the Arabian Peninsula, went extinct in the wild in the 1970s and then was reintroduced into the wild from zoo populations. The California condor breeding program, which almost certainly saved the species from extinction, includes 5 zoos as active partners. Black-footed ferrets and red wolves in the United States and golden lion tamarins in Brazil, all endangered as well, have been bred at zoos for reintroduction into the wild. Okay, on and on like this. So we'd say, okay, she gives all this evidence of where it's happened. She doesn't give any evidence that they don't do this. So what would be the claim that we should really believe out of this? It's that they do this, but maybe they don't do it at as wide a scale as she expects for reasons that maybe I'll develop in my own argument as I go along. Okay, another thing that you might rebut is to say that the example is the exception, not the rule. So maybe someone makes a claim and say, and as an example of that, here's this. And I might say, well, that's not really representative of everything that happens. That's actually a really weird example that doesn't happen very often. So we shouldn't take that as evidence. Here's one from the article. She writes, early in the pandemic, the Neumünster Zoo in northern Germany coolly announced an emergency plan to cope with lost revenue by feeding some animals to other animals, compressing the food chain at the zoo like an accordion, until in the worst case scenario, only Vitus, a polar bear, would be left standing. So here she's trying to talk about how, okay, the zoos don't really do conservation. They're willing. Here's an example where they're willing to feed the animals to other animals. And we might say, okay, but there's a lot of reasons to not see that as the rule. This is in one zoo in northern Germany, and it's during the pandemic, and they announced it. Why did they announce it? Probably because they're looking to solicit more funding, so they don't have to do this. They don't want to do this. And ultimately, in the wild, aren't most animals that are carnivores going to eat other animals? How is that really a change from conservation? It's not what we expect from typical zoo practice. But this is an extreme emergency plan. This is an extreme condition for all of us. Human beings are also living under emergency plans. So I don't know if we should take that as evidence about zoos in general. Does that support the claim that zoos are bad for animals? I don't know. That seems like an exception. That might be something I say. Okay. Next, we might say that the evidence actually doesn't support the claim. This is, I think, one that can be tough because in the heat of a moment, of a debate, or when we're reading something, we kind of tend to nod along when someone says, for example. There's a kind of form of giving evidence that we don't always evaluate the relationship of the evidence to the claim, and sometimes it doesn't support it at all. So here's another. I have 2 for this one because there's a lot of this in articles, especially in things that seem particularly well researched or people kind of put in fact. Do these facts actually work in the way that, or is the only interpretation of this fact that it is evidence for the claim? So here she writes, AZA facilities report spending approximately $231 million annually on conservation projects. For comparison, in 2018, they spend $4.9 billion on operations and construction. So this is supposed to be evidence that the zoos are not focused on conservation. But I don't think that that's what it's evidence of. Obviously, zoos have to spend a lot more on operations because they have to run a daily operation of the zoo. So the fact that they spend, I think a pretty considerable amount, $231 million on conservation projects, just because it's less than their operating costs, doesn't mean that it's evidence that they don't care about conservation. If anything, that raw number, 231 million, what I would want to see that compared to is what are national governments spending on conservation in comparison with zoos? Is it really going to be something where we would say, oh, the zoos don't contribute anything? $231 million seems like a lot annually, I might argue again. So here's another one where I'd say this is maybe, I would say, more egregious kind of, and maybe I don't want to say intentionally misleading. I don't know what she was thinking, but I find this one to be pretty misleading. I was a little bit surprised. So she writes a 2018 analysis of the scientific papers produced by association members, again, of the Zoo Association, American Zoo Association, between 1993 and 2013, showed that just about 7% of them annually were classified as being about biodiversity conservation. Okay, so if only 7% of their papers are about biodiversity conservation, surely they're not concerned enough about conservation. Again, that's the claim that she's trying to make. But we go to the paper, and I've here put in the graph that she took this from. And we see, well, what are the other kinds of things that they're researching about? These are just categories made by the researchers. The other things are zoology, veterinary science, ecology, marine and freshwater science. And there are some that are specifically about biodiversity conservation. But you would imagine that any of those other topics could potentially be relevant to biodiversity conservation. So it doesn't seem to me, again, like that's evidence that they don't care about conservation. It seems to me that they definitely produce research on it. And I don't know what the expectation should be of how much of their research should be on conservation. She hasn't really established or argued for that. So that's another example where I don't know if the evidence actually supports the claim when we dig into it a little bit more. Okay, 3D. Evidence implies a poor model of causation or correlation. Now these get a little bit more complicated because they're going to make implicit inferences about a claim that's related to what causes something or something that is associated. These are very common arguments in so many kinds of argumentation that we have, so many different kinds of spheres of argumentation that we have. So we always want to be on the lookout of, well, is that really a good model of causation that they're implying there? There's the very common thing you learn in Statistics 101, that correlation doesn't imply causation, but oftentimes we accept correlation as an argument for causation under certain models. But let's look at 3D and what she's arguing there. In a 2011 study, researchers quizzed visitors at the Cleveland, Bronx, Prospect Park, and Central Park zoos about their level of environmental concern and what they thought about the animals. Those who reported a sense of connection to the animals at the zoo also correlated positively with general environmental concern. On the other hand, the researchers reported there were no significant differences in survey responses before entering an exhibit compared with those obtained as visitors were exiting. So this is supposed to be evidence that the zoo, which claims that its exhibits and people going to the zoo give people a better sense of environmental concerns and might lead them to do political advocacy in their own lives. And she's saying, on the one hand, that, there is a correlation between people who have a sense of connection at the zoo and general environmental concerns. So you're like, wait a minute, which side are you on? She's like, aha, but there's no difference from the time that they enter to the time that they exit. Well, what kind of model of causation is she imagining? She's kind of imagining a road to Damascus conversion experience that people have at the zoo, that you enter the zoo and you're like, I hate these stupid animals. I don't need to conserve any of these animals. Who cares about pandas? Why am I at the zoo, though? Obviously, the zoo makes it attractive to people who probably already have environmental concerns, general environmental concerns. It's a self-selecting group of people. But it might also kind of generate, not just through the exact experience of that exhibit, a broader possibility of why people might have that, because they want to go to the zoo and they might have experiences there that kind of build up over time. It doesn't have to happen exactly in the moment from when you enter to when you exit. That's kind of a weird assumption when you think about it. What would that look like? Why would we expect that at all? That seems actually very strange if someone were to kind of go in with a negative general environmental attitude and come out with a positive one at the end of the exhibit. That doesn't seem very likely. So that might be another kind of way that we look for problems that we can find in other arguments and then use those as rebuttal. Okay, 3E. The argument makes a false modal assumption. Okay, what do I mean by this? Modality is a huge part of argumentation, and it's a little bit complicated maybe to think about, but it's not really that different from a lot of things we're used to thinking about. It's just a way of grouping or naming a bunch of related arguments. These are arguments about necessity versus possibility, or actuality. We could say plausibility. All those kinds of ideas are modal ideas. And there are ideas that people have about what is necessary or what is possible that arguments often rely upon in making connections between claims and reasons. So here's an example again from the article. She writes, people don't go to zoos to learn about the biodiversity crisis or how they can help. They go to get out of the house, to get their children some fresh air, to see interesting animals. They go for the same reason people went to zoos in the 19th century, to be entertained. Now, why does this have anything to do with a modal argument? The potential modal problem that I see here is she acts as if these are mutually exclusive possibilities. But these seem to me to be compatible possibilities, that people can go to the zoo to be entertained and also to learn about the biodiversity crisis. What would be the priority motivation? Obviously, you kind of put some sugar on the stick. People mostly want to be entertained, but it doesn't mean that doesn't exclude the possibility that they're also going to learn about the biodiversity crisis, or that they learn about it when they're there, even if they're not motivated to go there for that reason. So I would say that's a kind of problem of thinking about what kinds of things are compatible, compossible, and what are not. And she kind of makes an assumption that I don't think is really warranted on the basis of what she tells us. I'm really beating up on this one person's argument, but it's just to kind of make points. We could probably do this for anything, which is part of what makes it interesting. You can find ways of rebutting lots of arguments. Okay. 3G, the argument is support only for part of the claim. So in an argument, this often looks like kind of mitigating the effect or the power, the force of a particularly strong argument of your opponent. They say something and it's like, wow. People are really amazed. That seems to be kind of a smoking gun. People are really captivated by an argument. And one thing that you can do is kind of weaken that argument by saying, well, what it really proves is just a very small thing. So how does that look in this article? Here she makes, I think, some very compelling arguments about elephants. She says elephants are particularly unhappy in zoos given their great size, social nature, and cognitive complexity. Many suffer from arthritis and other joint problems from standing on hard surfaces. Elephants kept alone become desperately lonely, and all zoo elephants suffer mentally from being cooped up in tiny yards, while their free-ranging cousins walk up to 50 miles a day. Zoo elephants tend to die young. At least 20 zoos in the United States have already ended their elephant exhibits, in part because of ethical concerns about keeping the species captive. So this is all very compelling evidence, but remember, what's the claim here? That zoos are bad for animals. No, she's just giving us evidence that zoos are bad for elephants. And look, she's also told us that zoos are aware of this. 20 zoos in the United States have already gotten rid of their elephant exhibits. Animals are very different. That's one of the things that zoos teach us. It's not just biodiversity in terms of the existence of species, but one of the things we get to experience in a zoo is the actual diversity of species, how different they are, how their different personalities, the way that they think, feel, how they relate to us, all of that's very different. And one thing we maybe have learned from the zoo is how different the elephants are in the sense of other animals that we might find there. And so this is an easily ameliorable problem, which isn't to get rid of zoos, but just to stop having elephants at zoos, right? So that's a kind of mitigating rebuttal. Okay, finally, for this long question on the support for their claims, we go to 3H. Evidence supports a more nuanced view. So that if we dig into the evidence here, which can be difficult outside of written arguments, we sometimes find things that are very different from how it's represented in a particular argument. So one of the things she talks about here are the psychological or stereotypified behavior, stereotypes they call them, of certain organisms, certain animals in zoos. And I went into the article that she cites for one of these arguments, which is called Can't Stop, Won't Stop, is stereotypy a reliable animal welfare indicator? So while the study does show that, yes, in zoos, stereotypy behavior is increased in those kinds of situations, they actually make the conclusion that these are not reliable indicators of animal welfare because they can be elicited by or persist in situations that improve welfare. So the fact that we see this kind of behavior in zoos, though intuitively or naively, we might kind of think, oh, that must mean that the animals are sad or unhappy. That's actually us being anthropomorphizing. And that the studies that she herself cites give this very different view. So we can't really take that as a reliable indicator. All right, finally, we can actually look at the language of our opponent's claims, which is a little bit different from challenging the claim, the support, or the relationship between the claim and the support, because we're focusing on their choice of words, how they phrase something, and often this is related to a relationship between the speaker and the audience with a specific claim. So a couple of problems you might have, they might use language that's vague or overgeneralized. The language might be misleading or it might be inflammatory. So let's look at a few examples of this. I mean, are these really examples? We could give a more generous interpretation. But here, zoos are bad for animals. I would say there's lots of ways of rebutting this claim as saying this language is too vague. When you say zoos, do you mean all zoos? Or most of her examples of really practice she doesn't like are European zoos or sometimes American zoos. But there are lots of zoos in the world. So, what do you mean when you say zoos are bad for animals? Is it only exclusively bad for animals? She gives a lot of evidence that says it's not just bad for them. And for what animals? Are all animals the same? We just talked about this with elephants. So these are ways of kind of thinking about those specific use of terms. We can make it more precise. And in that sense, we're kind of rebutting the claim in that case. Okay. What about if it's a little bit misleading? She writes, a vast majority of zoo animals, there are 800,000 animals of 6,000 species in the AZA zoos alone, will spend their whole lives in captivity, either dying of old age after a lifetime of display or being culled as surplus. Now, there's a lot of things in here that I think are kind of misleading. When she says that when she says they will spend their whole lives in captivity, she just means they're going to live in a zoo. Right? I can use different language to describe that. Sure, we can think about it as captivity, but what does that really mean here when we're debating about a zoo? It's kind of loading the argument against what I want to claim, which is that zoos are good. And she says, either dying of old age, isn't that a good death for an animal? After a lifetime of display, she's trying to kind of insinuate something that's not a good life, but she doesn't really support that claim. But here's the part I really want to focus on, where she says, or being culled as surplus. This gives the misleading impression that zookeepers are going around with rifles and just kind of being like, oh, I'm tired of feeding these animals. We don't have enough. I'm just going to kill a few. But when you look into what she's really talking about there, this is not at all the practice of culling animals. It doesn't really happen that way. And that practice is pretty rare that she talks about. So the use of those two words, culled and surplus, try to create this impression of zoos being these very cold places. And I just don't think I think that's pretty misleading. And finally, on a similar note, it can be inflammatory. She says the practice of killing surplus animals is kept quiet by zoos. Again, this kind of conspiratorial attitude towards the zoos. But it happens, especially in Europe. In 2014, the director of the EAZA at the time estimated that between 3,000 and 5,000 animals are euthanized in European zoos each year. But when we go to this link, once again, she uses this term animals. Most people are going to imagine lions, tigers, bears, panthers, monkeys, elephants, the stuff that she's just been mentioning. And then it says, that's our estimate for all animals management euthanized in the zoo, be it tadpoles up until a giraffe. What about the numbers of larger animals, lions, tigers, bears, giraffes, and so on? I would expect that to be less than a few hundred. So it's not to say that is wrong, that is a fact, but the idea of kind of suggesting that it's animals, when it's animals and it's euthanizing animals like tadpoles maybe, that actually shows a kind of extreme level of care in the way that they report their numbers, I would say. So anyway, this has been a video about ways of thinking about rebuttal. There's so many other ways that we can kind of relate to our opponent's claims. We can say we have a different principle. We don't think those arguments are relevant. But in rebuttal, what we're really doing is taking an explicit argument that the opponents have made and reformulating some of what it means, either by focusing on the claim, the support, the relationship between the claim or the support, or the language of the claim or the support, and trying to suggest to the audience that they should understand it differently than our opponents want them to understand it. I hope you've enjoyed this video. Please like and subscribe if you're interested in more Rhetoric Prof content, and I'll see you in the next video.